Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be reviewing the performance of Evander Kane over this entire season, regular season and playoffs. So, of course, this was Evander Kane's first full season as a San Jose Shark. He was acquired from the Buffalo Sabres in the previous year at the deadline. He played about 20 games with the Sharks and then the full time through the playoffs before they were eliminated at the hands of the Golden Knights, and he was rewarded with a contract, and this was his first full year. So, in that year, his frequent line mates were, in the regular season, it was normally Kane, Hurdle, and Donskoy, this mostly being seen before the arrival of Gustav Nyquist, who really shook up the top six for the Sharks. And then, of course, in the playoffs, the most common line for Kane was him with Hurdle and Pavelski. This is after Pavelski returned from his injury. That's where Kane spent the majority of his time. For his regular season stats, he played 75 games, which is actually pretty good for Evander Kane, who has had a tendency of missing a lot of games through the season, or at least a few games through the season. A small injury and then some small personal issues going on for him. 30 goals, which was very nice to see, to hit the 30-goal mark. One of 4 Sharks who managed to actually do so this season. 26 assists for 56 points. Certainly not bad for a mostly second-line winger, as well as a -4. Nothing really to write home about. Not particularly impressive. Not that bad. What is the really, the stat that stands out is the 153 penalty minutes. Now, of course, there are a lot of, major penalties, misconducts, game misconducts littered in there that really cause it to rise up. But when it comes to just minor penalties, Evander Kane still had, I believe, 38 minor penalties at all strengths throughout the regular season. That's almost one minor penalty every other game. And for someone who like Evander Kane, who's supposed to be a pest of sorts, and so you're expecting there to also be a lot of penalties drawn, well, he did draw a decent amount, but he ended up still being a -10 in that regard. So he had 10 less penalties drawn than penalties taken. And when you're at that high of a number, 38 penalties taken, you're probably hurting your team a decent amount by having them kill so many penalties. And the Sharks' penalty kill was mostly solid throughout most of the regular season, so it really wasn't all that bad. But you would still like for Evander Kane not to take that edge out of his game, but maybe to play it a bit more, a bit more conservatively when it comes to things like tripping penalties and high-sticking penalties, because he got caught for a lot of those. When it comes to maybe roughing and things like that, maybe you can keep that in his game because you want to see him have that edge, but a lot of the stick infractions you'd like to see eliminated. And just for, I guess, comparison's sake, the player who had the second most minors on the team was Timo Meier with only 24, so that's 14 less, and Timo Meier himself had 36 penalties drawn. He was a +12 in that regard, so Meier fits that role a bit better, as he only had 55 penalty minutes. That's 100 less than Evander Kane, just about, with less minors drawn, or minors taken, and more minors drawn. So Meier did a good job in that role, but Evander Kane maybe went a bit too far, a bit too many times. For his time on ice, 18 minutes and 25 seconds, actually had the most time on ice for forwards at even strength in both the regular season and the playoffs, so it showed that DeBoer did rely on him heavily. He had some decent power play time, but of course Evander Kane normally found himself on the second unit, and he also had some pretty decent shorthanded time, hovering at around just a minute. So Evander Kane playing in all situations and surprisingly getting the most ice time for even strength. I know Evander Kane had a tendency to get double shifted at times onto the third or fourth line, and sometimes Evander Kane would take shifts much longer than he probably needed to, but still, it's interesting to see that DeBoer does trust him a lot in that regard. Into the playoffs, and this is where Evander Kane began to struggle somewhat. 20 games played, so he played the full thing. 2 goals only during that. That's only a pace of about 8 or 9 goals through the entire season, with 6 assists and 8 points, with a -4, so that didn't change much, but still 61 penalty minutes. I believe that is 12 minors, which would put him on pace in an entire season of 48 minors, which again is just much too many, really. I believe he was a -5 from penalties taken to penalties drawn during the playoffs as well. So it is, again, a lot more hurting than it is a lot good for Evander Kane when it comes to these penalties. And I know a lot of those came against the Golden Knights with what was going on between him and Reeves and everything like that. But still, you want to be able to stay out of the penalty box a bit more when it comes to some of these more minor penalties like the stick infractions of hooking and then things like that. When it comes to the time on ice, it takes its usual hop of the playoffs to about 19 minutes and 52 seconds. As I said, again, leading in ice time for even strength. So even though he finds himself in the penalty box a lot, Evander Kane still manages to find himself on the ice at even strength more than any other Sharks player on the team. And so if he can get maybe a bit more consistency with the goal scoring, with the time on ice that he is getting, the goal scoring should hopefully at least remain the same going into the next season, if not go up slightly, especially in the playoffs. For his grades during the first quarter, a B-, second quarter, a B- as well. His third quarter was extremely impressive. I believe that was the time where he had a good 15 goals during that time span. Got him an A. Then in the fourth quarter, a C, where most of the Sharks players struggled. And in the playoffs, a disappointing D+, which basically on average gives him about a B-, but because his playoffs were actually rather disappointing, I give him the final grade on the entire season of a C+. Class dismissed.